Good morning. I always find it fascinating, me as a Swiss and non-lawyer, speaking about the EU Directive, PSD2. Well, there are some technical sides to it, so we stick to that and don't speak about the law stuff, etc. As you all know, the two main aspects of PSD2 are access to account, given to third parties, and also, obviously, the strong customer authentication, which is now required when accessing your account. Well, the former requires the latter. And for the former, you have several options, and most of them actually, they focus, obviously, on the banking side, on the transactions, on how you integrate with your backends, etc. There are several options, as I mentioned, for example, the Open Banking API, which came out of the UK, which is actually required in the UK to be implemented. Then there's the Berlin Group, probably all of them, better than I do, which also has just published an API. There is obviously FinTS in Germany, which will go into that direction and provide the functionality of access to account for third parties. But none of them really address the authentication part. So that is then left up to, well, at least to the bank. Just for my interest, how many of you represent banks? So just a few. All the rest of you are for fintech, third parties, etc. Is that right? Mostly, okay. My presentation is more from the view of the bank right now, because the bank has to do the strong customer authentication stuff. They have to implement give the possibility for access to accounts. So most of the challenges are on their side right now, but there obviously are a few challenges for the third parties as well, and we get to them. Historically, a user accessed his bank account through the web interface that the bank provided, the e-banking application. Now with PSD2, there is this new method, the access to account, giving third parties the ability to access that information and present it to the user. So the third party basically takes over the UI, and it can aggregate information over several different banks, etc. Some functionality which is very good for some customers. But I mean, we already had that before. Think about Sofort.com, Sofortzahlung, they all did that. Kind of, they initiated payments through their own interface with the banks. But what they did was they used or abused the web interface using screen scraping. Now in PSD2, screen scraping is prohibited. You're no longer allowed to do that. The reason for that, I don't really know. And also, sorry, brought a call with me from Switzerland. So, there is a discussion going on, or went on, between the European Banking Authority and the European Commission about that screen scraping stuff. Because the European Commission wanted to retain the possibility of screen scraping, because that for fintechs and providers makes it much easier to access the banks, because they already have it in place today. And the European Banking Authority didn't want that. But in the end, there is kind of a prohibition in the regulation. But there is kind of a fallback. If the API does not really work, etc., then third parties are allowed, or the regulators are allowed to open up the possibility of screen scraping. But for the moment, assume screen scraping is no longer allowed. That means we need this kind of dedicated interface. Usually it's an API. Obviously, there's a lot, it makes a lot of sense to have something like that. But if you do that, then the user accesses the third party in the name of the user, of the customer, accesses the bank. Now, we need some way to involve the user in that transaction so that the user really can give the permission for the third party to access that account. And that's where the strong authentication comes into play. I'm going to look at a few options that you have there, how that can be implemented. First, we have something called embedded strong customer authentication. I have heard that, well, maybe you can explain it to me in the breaks, during the breaks. I have heard that several third-party providers really prefer that option, and I don't get it, because there are so many problems involved with it. First off, yeah, granted, you get the UI, so it's integrated in your own application, and it's kind of, it looks like one single piece. But I mean, for years, the financial industry has campaigned against users, customers providing their banking credentials on other websites than their banks. And now, what you're asking them is exactly doing that. So that's the first major hurdle that you have to overcome. If you want to do that, basically what you need to implement is end-to-end encryption of the credentials, or at least the password. So if the password is then passed through the third-party provider to the bank, that the third-party provider cannot decrypt it, cannot have a look at it, doesn't get it. Because, you see, in PSD2, the bank has an obligation to protect against man in the middle. And this is exactly man in the middle. So you have to work against that. By the way, for the third parties, there is also a challenge, because I mean, we have strong customer authentication, and there are several different mechanisms to do that. And if you control the UI, you have to give the possibility or the ability to, or you have to have that UI for all these different mechanisms. Be that flickering, be that MTON, be that phototon, be that whatever different mechanism there is out there. And you have to do that for all the banks you want to integrate. And if the bank changes something, you have to adapt your application to follow that. So it's, as I said, I don't really get it. Finally, there is, in PSD2, there is the requirement that you have a binding between the strong authentication and the payment data. So if you have to authenticate for a payment, that payment data must be visible to the user. And usually, if you work, we will see that in 2 slides. If you work with tokens, etc., then that information must be included in the token. Now, here, because I mean, you need to have a channel to the end user to present that data to him. And again, you need to protect against man in the middle. And you don't really have, as a bank, you don't really have a direct channel. So the only option you have here is that somehow you communicate that data during authentication on an encrypted channel to the user, which then gets decrypted on the customer's browser or in the customer's browser and displayed to the user. The next option is called decoupled. So there is nothing tying these kinds of communications together, except that if the third party accesses the bank initiates the strong customer authentication. So, but because there is no communication between the bank, you know, the browser is communicating with the third-party web application. There is no interaction with the bank at that moment. So the bank can employ something like a push mechanism. MTON, for example, would be that would be an example, but we come to that later. Then sends a push mechanism to the user. To do that, the user requires a smartphone. So this mechanism only works if the customers have smartphones or devices that work like smartphones. Okay. Personally, I like that scheme because it separates the two. There is no man in the middle, and there is only communication between the customer and the bank directly. So the customer gets that push mechanism, push information, and then can react directly to the bank and say, okay, yes, this is correct, I tried to initiate that payment, or I allow that third party to get access to my bank account. There's a third option. Basically, I thought when they designed PSD2, the RTS, etc., they were thinking about this one. It's an internet standard behind it. Some people call it delegated strong customer authentication. The standard behind it is OAuth 2, invented some years ago by Facebook, now in place in several different big social web applications. What happens is when the third party tries to access the bank either denies the access because it's not authorized, or the third party automatically knows, yeah, I don't have authorization, and redirects the user to the bank. So the web browser then directly communicates with the bank. The problem obviously here is the UI breaks, because the bank takes over the UI at that moment. It also has a positive aspect in that the user sees, oh, I'm communicating with the bank. So I'm allowed to enter my user credentials, etc. During that authentication, where the bank can really employ all that strong authentication mechanism that it wants to, you have a step called consenting, where the bank provides information about what the third party wants to do, access that account or initiate a payment. And that information can be displayed to the user, and the user really says, okay, I want to do that. Kind of like some transaction signing that has been in place in Germany for years, where you get that information on the second channel, okay, you want to initiate a payment to that person over this amount, and then you say, yes, that's the code I got, I confirm by entering the code. So it's very similar to that. And then you integrate that information into the token, send it to the third party presents the token to the bank, and the bank can verify all that. It's a very nice circle. There are some issues with that. First, OAuth really is not, what's the second one? The standard really doesn't provide for what you're trying to do here. Because what happens is you use so-called dynamic scopes. Scope being the mechanism for OAuth to require a permission, to request a permission. And they, in the standard, are defined as to be prescribed in the configuration. So they're not very dynamic. But if you want payment data to be implemented or to be integrated, it has to be dynamic somehow. So you're kind of extending it in a non-standard way, and extending security protocols on its own or by your own is not always the smartest idea. It can work, but as far as I know, nobody has ever really on a security basis tried to find out if that's what happens if you do that. What happens if you have dynamic scopes? Also, usually if you do that, you have a very tight integration with the business side of the bank. So that the banking application and the authentication system have to work very tightly together. Well, that might pose a problem when you have a larger strategy of implementing a portal, for example, and you want to have that authentication system for all your functionality, not just for PSD2 or e-banking, etc. Foremost, but that applies a little bit also to the other strong authentication mechanism, account selection. Usually what you have is you have a user account. That user account, a login name, kind of a customer number with credentials. And that gives you access to several different accounts. Now, if you allow that using OAuth, then the third party presents that token. How would the bank know which account he wants to access? Because that token basically gives him access to all accounts. And you want to make sure that you don't do that, at least the banks do. So you must implement something, some mechanism in the consent step to select the account that this token really applies to. By the way, there is an alternative to OAuth 2, OpenID Connect. By the way, Open Banking API, the one in the UK, they rely on OpenID Connect, but not on OAuth 2. Okay, there are some additional challenges. User experience. PSD2 places much more focus on security than on user experience. And that has to be overcome somehow. As Martin mentioned before, users don't like strong authentication. It's just cumbersome. So what you can do is you can work with something like risk-based authentication, where you apply your risk function and then determine, well, he needs strong authentication or he doesn't. You can have something called adaptive authentication, what you also mentioned, let the user choose, give them the ability to select between different strong authentication mechanisms, the one which he most likes. And for the push time, there's an issue for the push side. Most easy would be to use mTOM for that. Send an SMS with the code. Now there is a requirement in PSD2 which says that on a smartphone, the recipient of a push message has to be completely separated from every other application on that system. And because SMS is completely integrated into the system, and especially on Android, it can be received by any app you have on that device, there is no separation. So basically that means mTOM is dead. You're not allowed to use it anymore with PSD2. As I said, I'm not a lawyer, so there might be some disagreement on that. But if you read through the PSD2 documentation, it can be interpreted like that. So that leaves you, or at least the banks, with a lot of challenges in technical side. Just to close with an ad, what we do and what we help our customers with is implementing different strategy, different technologies to support all these communications. You see the blue ones, so that these are the banking applications. And on the bottom you have your infrastructure, the servers, the network, etc. And what we kind of supply is a service in the middle which provides the security services, the strong authentication, the handling of the APIs, the security of the APIs. We don't do the APIs, but the security of all that. So if you are interested in that, my friends are outside. I will be here today. I can answer your questions. And we have a customer of ours who will have a presentation of what they also did with this kind of infrastructure. I think it takes place at 11 o'clock in the next room. Okay. Thank you.